After the USS Gregory, a high-speed transport ship, was sunk by Japanese destroyers, French, who was a mess attendant and among the few uninjured crew members, took it upon himself to rescue his fellow sailors. French swam for approximately 8 hours in treacherous conditions, towing a life raft with 15 injured crew members away from the danger of both enemy fire and the nearby sharks. He demonstrated remarkable courage and skill, stating he was more afraid of the Japanese than the sharks. His determination to save his comrades led him to tie a rope around his waist and swim through the night while instructing his shipmates to guide him in the right direction. At dawn, French and the raft were spotted by scout aircraft, which dispatched a rescue craft to retrieve them.
No greater love. Unity is our greatest strength. Welcome back to More War Monday. The Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube, our X Spaces simulcast, Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, and Roku. Well, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. That's from the Bible, John 15:13. And that is how American troops feel about each other. We believe there's no difference between us, regardless of the circumstances we were born into. The newest Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, says it best. Our unity is our greatest strength. Even in the recent times of attempts to divide us by things like skin color, again, through misguided policies, we do not see our teammates through that lens, only the lens of our common mission, fighting and winning America's wars. Charles Jackson French saw things the same way on that day he volunteered to return to Navy service after Pearl Harbor. Think about that. And he certainly proved it through his heroic actions of great valor to save his shipmates without regard for his own safety after the USS Gregory was sunk in combat off the coast of Guadalcanal in 1942. Petty Officer French's story is intertwined with our own and the history of our country. We are responsible for honoring Charles's story, but telling it also to our children and grandchildren. For those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, as the saying goes. Petty Officer French's story is also one of human frailty. He apparently suffered from post-traumatic stress, as many of our veterans today suffer, and passed away relatively young in life. Addicted to alcohol is a likely way to soothe his demons. Today, I'm honored to have as my guest Carol Ingle Averitt today. Carol is a military historian and author of a wide variety of Christian books, as well as having been the Holmes editor for Southern Living magazine. She's here to talk with me today about her book about Mr. French, Midnight in Iron Bottom Sound, the harrowing World War II story of heroism in the shark-infested waters of Guadalcanal. Claire, welcome to the Rob Maness Show, Carol.
Thank you so much, Colonel. It's a delight to be with you today.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on and spending this hour with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
You probably heard the theme of Monday's show on my live shows is More War Monday, because we've had so much war around the world. But our goal is to make it a historical day about the heroes that have shown themselves in wartime. And this show is dedicated to that effort to change from having to report on real war to talking about the historical aspects of war heroes, especially American ones. So I deeply appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate the book too. And you have a military history in your family, right? So just take a second and tell us what inspired you to write this particular book. Because you've written military.
Yes, I will do that. And thank you again so very much for having me. This story, I actually came across this truly by accident when I was doing my research for my previous military history book, Marine Raiders, the true story of the legendary World War II battalion. And as so often occurs, sometimes those little, in quotes, little stories behind the scenes of the unsung heroes, the ones that do the yeoman's work and not really up in the headlights, so to speak, really give us a real deep knowledge and information for what it really means to be brave, to be courageous, to put put others before self. And so as I was researching Marine Raiders, I kept coming across the stories of these little destroyer transports. And the USS
Hmm.
Gregory was one of them. They were ships that had been in mothball. They were World War I ships, had been in mothball for 20
Yeah.
years. And when the Navy realized that they needed to have some additional ships to carry men around the oceans, these were refitted and stripped almost of all of their armament, and also two stacks and two boilers in order to get a company of Marine Raiders in there. And so I only read just a little bit here and there about it. But what I read in my research for Marine Raiders, when I finished that book, I thought, you know what? I'm going to do a deep dive, no pun intended, into these little ships that were so
Yeah.
pivotal and so important in World War II. And as a result, when I started researching USS Gregory, then some of these names that were members of that ship, shipmates, sailors on that ship,
Hmm.
began to surface, and that was when I, again in quotes, discovered the story of Charles Jackson French. And I'm telling you, Colonel Maness, I was just absolutely taken with this story, having done quite a bit now of military history research and reading stories and all. I thought to myself, and of course, back in the 40s, our military was segregated. And
Right.
so when a black sailor, soldier, whatever, um, did an unusual feat of bravery and courage, it was really not recognized as it would be today. And so as a result, but when I read his French's story, I thought this young man should have received a medal for this. He
Yeah.
really only received a letter of accommodation for this incredible feat that he did, saving so many lives. So I was taken with the story. And I got hold
Yeah.
of his
Yeah.
records. I got hold of all of his records. I got hold of the records of two or three other sailors that were instrumental in that story. And not because I wrote it, but I just have to tell you, it's one of the most amazing, unknown stories I've ever had the privilege and delight to come across.
Yeah, and Charles, his you nailed it when you said his selfless act. He put others before himself. Tell us about Charles Jackson's French, real quick, Carol, and where he came from, and what put him at that moment in time in those waters with these other men. Because there's a few characters in the book that you really they seem to have surfaced, like you said, bubbled up to the surface in the telling of the
Exactly.
story. And he
Ex-
obviously is the central one in
exactly.
this discussion.
Exactly.
So so who is Charles Jackson's French?
Right. Exactly. Well, he was born in Foreman, Arkansas, to a sharecropper. And he had several brothers and sisters. And of course, as a little young kid in Foreman, they were actually raised in the bottomlands, which is some very, very fine farming area there in Arkansas. And without having, a lot of things to play with and toys and so on and so forth, um, he and the young people his friends, wound up playing at the water's edge of the Red River, which is a 1,200-mile river. It runs, as you know, the boundary between Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma. It is it's an iconic river. John Wayne made a great movie about Red River, but it is
Yeah.
one of the most perilous rivers that we have in our nation. And this is where, even though he was admonished not to go into those waters because they were treacherous, As any
Hmm.
kid that's got some gumption, when you're told no, that's the very thing you'd like to do. And
Yeah.
Charles taught himself to swim in the Red River, and that was why he was such a strong swimmer. Of course, back in 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, Black Americans were not thought of as being swimmers. People really didn't think they could swim. And
Hmm.
so I can just imagine some of the stories that developed once Charles was in the Navy. He probably said something about, oh, I'm a good swimmer, I'm a great swimmer, whatever. And I can imagine some of those shipmates saying, oh, for crying out loud, French, we know you can't swim. And how ironic that on that night when the Gregory was spotted, and that whole story is incredible. It was an accident. It was really an unfortunate accident that they were spotted by the Japanese. But
Hmm.
he was in the belly of the ship because he was a mess attendant. He was in the galley, cleaning,
Right.
cooking, whatever. The other sailors were mostly manning their guns up on deck, trying to save the ship. As a result, though, Charles was not injured, as so many, the majority of the sailors were. And
Hmm.
so when he jumped into the water, when the abandoned ship order came out, he was not wounded, so he could go around and start helping some of these that were so badly wounded in the water. So it's just remarkable. That is really the story of Charles. When he was about 11 years old, and I've done a lot of research on this, there were a couple of articles that said his parents both died, and that is true, but not when he was 7. I believe, best I can calculate, he was not much older. He was about 11, probably.
Hmm.
And his dad passed away, and then about a year later, best again I can tell, his mother passed away. And so, you know, I can. It's hard to imagine that under for anyone would be such a difficult situation. And he had an older sister who had already moved to Omaha, Nebraska, because work opportunities were better there. And
Hmm.
so she wound up taking him in. And that really was where he enlisted his first time in the Navy, was in Omaha.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because he volunteered to join the Navy in the first place before there
I,
was a World War II
Well,
or
you know
Pearl
what?
Harbor.
A lot of the men that and perhaps women, but mostly young men, one of the
Mhm.
reasons that they joined the military back there then in the late, mid to late 30s, this was Depression era. And
Yeah.
so a lot of them probably were simply looking for, a place to latch on to
Mm.
in the Navy, or in the military. You get 3 squares a day. You get clothes, and so
Yeah.
I suspect that was part of his reasoning, early
Yeah.
on, was to do that.
Yeah.
And you'll love this now that you've brought up that. Why did he want to enlist? And we've sort of identified some of the reasons that so many young men enlisted back in the late 30s. His
Hmm.
first, I have both his enlistment pictures, his first one, and also when he went back in, re-enlisted. He was 5'6" in his first one. He was about 5'7.5" in his second one. Plus, he had gained weight. So
Yeah.
the Navy food was good for him. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was pretty young when he went in the first time. Well, we got to take a break, Carol. When we come back, though, we'll see a little clip about a historical marker that's been dedicated to Charles,
Yes.
and continue. I want to continue to talk about this story and talk about the one of the main characters, in addition to Mr. French, Bob Adrian, and then get you to tell us about the captain of the USS Gregory, because it's two very interesting stories, and Adrian is a key to knowing a lot of what we know about what happened. We'll be right back with Carol Abriet, the author of Iron Bottom Midnight and Iron Bottom Sound.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. I want to thank you for all your support at wvwfoundation.com that helps make possible pushing out 24/7 content for free. Without your support, we'd have to put it all behind a paywall. But thanks to you and your support through our foundation, we're able to push it out for free as a broadcast service and broadcast ministry of WVW Foundation. Please consider going there and setting up an automatic monthly contribution, or go there and make an occasional contribution. If you prefer to support us through the mail, you'll find our mailing address there at wvwfoundation.com. You can also call and make your contribution over the phone by calling 901-825-0652. That's 901-825-0652. Again, all these details are available at wvwfoundation.com. Thank you for your support as we try to help people around the world understand the times through the lens of a Christian worldview.
Federal and local leaders unveil a new honor for Omaha's World War II hero. A historical marker recognizes Petty Officer First Class Charles Jackson French. It sits outside the Charles Jackson French Post Office on Maple Street. French was aboard the USS Gregory when Japanese gunfire sunk it. He saved the lives of 15 fellow sailors by swimming through shark-infested waters. His nephew says the marker allows French's story to reach and inspire more people.
By this person doing this, this might encourage some others maybe to join the perhaps Navy, to go in and to do some good.
Earlier this year, the Navy also announced a new destroyer would be named in honor of Charles Jackson French.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and we're talking about a historical war hero from World War II from the United States, Charles Jackson French, a U.S. Navy petty officer. And the story that's in the book, Midnight and Iron Bottom Sound, a story about the harrowing experience of the USS Gregory and its crew, and the heroism of Petty Officer First Class Charles Jackson French, who you just heard about there, with the historical marker and the post office being dedicated in his name. And that heroism really should go down in the annals of U.S. Navy history, and it is, and it hasn't always been buried either. But, you know, it happened at a time in our country's history when relations between the races weren't what they were supposed to be. And unfortunately, that did allow some of this stuff, this information, to kind of get buried to history, only known to those that really directly participated in it after the initial publicity on it. And the author of the book is here with me, Carol Abriette. And Carol, you know, it's interesting. The USS Gregory itself, you know, as part of this modified destroyer from World War I, becomes a fast transport to transport the Marine Raider units, and the captain of that ship is talked about in the book. Tell us about Captain Harry Bauer and his role in all this, and his relationship with what you found out with Mr. French.
Right. Okay. Just a couple of quick things. And don't feel badly about this, okay? What I'm getting ready to say, I have a little correction of something you said, because Admiral Pringle, who wrote the foreword, was not, I mean, if you haven't researched, you're not totally aware. The term petty officer was not used for these galley people until the 50s. So his actual term rank rate would be mess attendant. And of course, you have first, second, and third class of that. And then if you got a really big promotion, you were called a steward. So just so things have moved a long way since then. And then secondly, the Navy touted these destroyer transport conversions to be fast. And that is questionable and questioned by most of the sailors who were on them. So these, what they converted were called four stackers or flush deckers. And so in order to make room for an additional 120 Marine raiders inside the ship. They took out 2 stacks and 2 boilers, and so and almost all the armament. So they were greatly reduced in speed. All of the accounts that I read, these sailors used to laugh about people calling them these, the higher ups in the Navy calling them high-speed transports. They were slow, and unfortunately that was one of the things that caused them to be so dangerous. So getting on to the commanding officer, Harry Bower. He is such an interesting person as well. His father was a sergeant major in the cavalry, 7th Cavalry. Harry had already been able to go around the world a couple of times before he was even 14, 15 years old, traveling with his father. In fact, Sergeant Major Bower, the father, actually got permission to bring to the Philippines when he was stationed in Manila his wife and children. So Harry was up close and personal with a lot of military growing up, and his desire, he began to have this incredible desire. He wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and sure enough, he was able to get an appointment. Graduated from Chattanooga High School, right there in Tennessee. He was editor of the school newspaper. He was the major in the ROTC there, and so very, very popular, very, very well liked. They said he was just he liked everyone, was so kind to everyone. He would loan you anything and never even ask you to return it. So he was a great guy. And he went to Annapolis and graduated from Annapolis, and then of course went on active duty, and was actually teaching at the academy, and then had been asked to go to naval headquarters in DC a couple of years before the war breaks out, and he worked under a gentleman that everyone knows the name of, Admiral Nimitz. Well, Nimitz was in D.C. right at the start of all of the war things, and about 10 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Harry Bower was given his quote unquote his own ship, which was the USS Gregory, and he was just thrilled with that assignment. And so he created, I think, given the kind of personality and young man that he was, you can imagine that he created a culture of camaraderie, a culture of wonderful togetherness in terms of we're all in this together. We're going to respect one another. We're going to work hard. We're going to do our jobs, but we're going to have a good crew. We're going to be together on this thing. So he was evidently just a really, someone said, one of the other people that I read about that actually had known Harry personally said he was a prince of a young man. So, and he also was a speaker in high school and college at his Presbyterian church, oftentimes. So there was also a very spiritual aspect to Lieutenant Commander Bower.
Well, you tell a couple of anecdotes in the book about the interaction between Petty Officer French and Captain Bower. A lot of it, some of it revolves around sandwiches, but I picked up on part of the story that, as a commander myself in the Air Force, was one of my habits. And Mr. Bower always talked to people around him, especially the junior enlisted, to ask them questions like, "Where are you from?" and have a conversation with them, didn't he?
That's exactly right. And again, that's establishing that culture that is just generates goodwill. It generates cooperation. It generates a desire to want to contribute to something that is bigger than just the individual. It is it's really like, and the more I have gotten into it, ships are really like little floating towns or little floating cities. And on a ship, by the time the Gregory, which had a crew enlisted and officers of around 120, let's say, give or take, then an additional 120 Marine Raiders. That's about 240 times 3 meals a day. And so you had a lot of opportunity there to interact and be a part of, a really interesting, some really interesting conversations. And I'm sure that with Harry Bauer being the sort of outgoing, obviously the outgoing kind of person that he was, friendly and a people person, you might would say. He probably loved talking and getting to know as many of his crew as he could. And of course, also among the crew, as you mentioned, was a young fella, an ensign named Bob Adrian. And what makes him so interesting is that he kept very, very lengthy diaries and journals later, after the war was over, and recorded numerous events and stories about Charles Jackson French. And he was actually on the raft. So we're not, I've got all these stories verified, in other words. He was
Yeah.
actually on the raft with French. And in fact, um, Ensign Adrian had received some shell fragments or something in one of his eyes, and it was completely closed. So he told French, he said, I'm going to help you guide this raft, but just understand you've got a one-eyed navigator on board. And this is just a little anecdote that I think you'll love, just given some of the other comments that you've made. When the war was over, and in later years, Captain Adrian tried his very best. His family has told me this. Tried his best to find French and couldn't. He just, he'd sort of disappeared from the landscape, and of course was having some tremendous problems himself. But Bob Adrian's daughter, Judy Decker, has told me that it just crushed her dad that he was never able to reconnect with French after the war, because he just wanted to hug him and tell him, thank you so much for being there and for saving us. And it's a so I know that these stories, then my point being, I know these stories are valid because I've got written information about them. Just an incredible story.
Yeah, that. Thanks for telling that. That doesn't surprise me, because when you share a highly stressful event like that in any way with anyone, you develop an emotional tie that
Yes.
really one really wants to strengthen that tie instinctively, even years after it's over. I met a man that I was probably the 8th or ninth person in the chain of people that saved his life. Army Lieutenant Colonel retired Brian Birdwell, who was the guy closest to the aircraft impact at the Pentagon on 9/11 that lived. And I met him 15 years after the fact. That just happened to get introduced to him by somebody that I just met. And we have a very strong tie, and we get together when we can. We communicate
Right.
when we can, reach out to each other just to say hello once a year on the anniversary at least once a year. So that emotional tie is very, very important. And I just so wish that Mr. Adrian had been able to do it. Well, we got to take
And-
another break. When we come back, we'll see another little clip, because there's more to this story. This story is, this man did this act of selflessness over a 6 to 8 hour period, but there's just more to the man and more to the team and more to the story that should be told. And we'll be right back with Carol Abriet, the author of Midnight and Iron Bottom Sound.
USS Gregory near the Guadalcanal when it was attacked by the Japanese Imperial Navy. The ship was sunk on September 5, 1942. There were around 15 survivors on a raft in the shark-infested waters. 23-year-old Charles Jackson French was one of them. Many were hurt, and they started drifting towards land, which in any other situation would have been a good thing. But in wartime, not every shore is a safe shore. The men knew if they beached where they were headed, they would probably be killed by enemy forces or taken prisoners of war as soon as they landed. But Charles Jackson French had a plan.
He told his fellow survivors he would get into the shark-infested water and tow them all to safety. They said he was crazy. They said it was impossible. They said the water was full of sharks. They said he would get himself killed. He said he wasn't afraid.
He tied a rope around his waist and he dove into the sea. He swam for 6 to 8 hours all night long, towing floating debris with 15 of his shipmates holding on. When he felt sharks touch him, he tried to float and stay still till they left. And then he swam again. He swam until landing craft discovered them and hauled them on board. He saved them all.
When they were safe on board the ship, French was told to go to a segregated area of the deck away from his shipmates. Remember, this was 1942 and things were different then. But the sailors he had saved, his crewmates, said absolutely not. He was a member of the crew of the USS Gregory, and he would remain with the crew of the USS Gregory. It was an encounter French never forgot.
An ensign who was on that raft told the story to an Associated Press reporter a short time later, and the story made the papers. Then it was reported on the radio that Charles Jackson French was a hero. He was called the Human Tugboat. He appeared before cheering crowds back in Omaha, and a gum company issued a card about his heroism. He was in comic strips, and the Chicago Defender newspaper named him Hero of the Year. William Rose Bennett wrote a poem about his heroic act called The Strong Swimmer.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and we're talking with the author, Carol Averett, of Midnight in Iron Bottom Sound, the story that tells this harrowing story about the sinking of the USS Gregory with its sister ship, the Little, I believe it was, at the hands of the Japanese Navy. And the survivors, some of them, about 15 of them, getting in a raft. And one of those young men volunteered, insisted on jumping in the water and towing that raft by swimming. The stories that I read, Carol, were that 6 to 8 hours he swam through the night on the night of September 5th, 1942, when the ship went down. And Guadalcanal is infamous for its shark-infested waters. That's amazing.
Yes.
Just listening to that story, it's no wonder that it was publicized, right? I mean, this was in 1942. They got 30 days of convalescent leave or something, or something like that. Even Mr. French did, but even though he wasn't really injured, he still got to go home for about a month or so, and then got reassigned back in the war, right? So during that time, the papers picked it up, and this company, the GUM company, made these cards, kind of like baseball cards, out of it.
Yes. Yes. One quick thing about the little clip that you just showed is just, again, a minor detail. They actually got to shore the next morning. And the reason, it was the MPs that came and said, no, we have the blacks have their camp over here, and you're in a white camp. And there were not only just some of the sailors that he had rescued, but there were Marine raiders in that camp that had been on the Gregory. And they stood up and they told the MPs, they said, no, you're not taking this guy anywhere. Here's what they said that I read, that in later years, French could never say this without breaking down and crying. The raider stood up and said, "You're not taking this guy anywhere. He's one of us." And that little phrase, "he's one of us," was what really just always brought such an emotional response to French when he would repeat that in later years. But yes, initially, there were some journalists who were on Guadalcanal. They picked up this story. They sent it back. I've tried to trace the exact thread, but it just, when it got back to the States, it actually showed as a small article in quite a few newspapers. And this is what is so fascinating. In his records, I found 2 letters that are priceless, that were in his records, from people who wrote to President Roosevelt inquiring about this hero, French. One of those, and I've printed those letters in full in the book. So your listeners will have to go and get the book in order to really see those letters. They're when the gentleman
I read them this morning. So go ahead and tell us about them.
they're just so poignant. One of them, it was written to President Roosevelt. He was 12 years old, and he said, "Dear Mr. President, I just think that I just read about Charles Jackson French, and I just think it's the bravest, thing I've ever read out. And I want to know more about him, and I just think he deserves a medal." And he said, "It makes me so proud." And he said, "And I colored too." He was 12 years old, and it shows you though what knowing knowing the bravery and the courage that this young man showed and what an influence it had on others as they read his story. And the second letter turned out to be the most unbelievable thing. It was written by a gentleman named Will, and he was a very well-to-do financier in New Orleans, had his own firm and so on and so forth. But as I was researching a little bit about him, I found out he was married to someone that was from Montgomery, Alabama, which is where I grew up. And years ago, when I was a school teacher, I taught a young boy named Andrew Will. And his father had an incredible art collection. I was an art teacher at that time, had an incredible art collection, and I used to take my students over to his house. It was just like going to a museum. Well, the Mr. Will that wrote President Roosevelt about Charles Jackson French and encouraged the president to honor this young man, this young black sailor, with appropriate awards and give him the proper recognition that he deserved, was the uncle of my former art student. So it was such a wonderful connection, and the Will family is so excited to even be a little bit, playing a little small part in the story of Charles Jackson French. So, these things are so fun when you start to research and find out about them. And but I've done a lot of thinking. Why then did the story get so lost? And part of it obviously is because it could be because it just dwindled out. But it's also because, see, this was the beginning of World War II. June 6th was 2 years away. The Normandy invasion, years away. The invasion convoy into the Solomon Islands on August 6th, 1942, was about 80 ships. The invasion convoy on June 6th, 1944, was about 8,000 ships and many more men. And that really then became such an incredible part, another aspect. So you had fighting, and then of course you had the Marines leaving the Solomon Islands and they're going up to Iwo, Peleliu, and you have all those ferocious things that happened up in that area. And so these stories that came at the very beginning of the war just sort of they just got lost in the shuffle is part of the reason. But also part of the reason I think we have to acknowledge is that Charles Jackson French really was not given um, recognition that was official. Let's put it like that. People loved the story, and but the official recognition has been a long time coming. But it is coming. A ship is going to
Yeah,
be
and
named.
yeah, and I think that's important. That's why I mentioned that in the opening monologue, and I'll mention it here again. Is that even today, warriors act. We respond exactly like those raiders did, and Charles's crewmates did. Those of us that have seen war together, there is no. We don't see skin color. We don't even these days see sex. We just see people that we have served with and gone through the fire with, and we're all one. We're all one. It's all that way. We're one of us. That's exactly what we would have
He's one
said
of us.
today.
Yes, he's one of
And
us.
it's crazy policies that people try to implement that get in the way of that. And I think that's probably why the reason why the U.S. Armed Forces was the lead in desegregation eventually when President Truman
Yes.
directed that. And we were able to pull it off to the extent that we pulled it off.
Yes.
That by the time I came in the military in the 1970s, there really was. I mean, it's not allowed. I have my name personally on senior commander memos of my own that say I don't tolerate racial discrimination.
Yes.
And those kind of things. And I think that's why is because it's ingrained in us it's just inherent is a value that we're all the same. We're all the
Yes.
same. We're here to do a mission, and we're all the same. So
Yes.
yeah, I'm glad that you brought it up because we need to do that. And I'm glad that Congressman Bacon, who I know personally, who's a retired Air Force general, has played a role
Yes.
in getting a lot of this recognition over the last few years.
Yes, he's
for-
U.S. representative from Nebraska, correct? Yes,
That's
General
correct.
Bacon.
From
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I've been praying that he can go ahead and get. I know a ship is a wonderful thing to that is a great honor, and I am. Don't get me wrong, I am so thankful that current Secretary Carlos del Toro has seen fit to have that made official. But it would sure be wonderful too for a medal posthumously to be awarded for him. Just one little quick thing. My father was career Navy. That's one of the reasons that I have such a fondness of the military. But he's just a minor. He's just part of the whole picture. He was stationed at Pearl on December 7th, 1941, and was actually he in the late 30s was the umpire for the Asiatic Fleet baseball team. So he also did. But now you with your Air Force background, and I thank you so much for your service. But you'll love this. His brother, my Uncle Jasper, was the chief mechanic for a fellow by the name of General Claire Lee Chenault of the Flying Tigers. And my Uncle Jasper was in Burma.
Wow.
Yeah, my Uncle Jasper was in Burma for a number of years before, and then later joined the Air Force and had a whole separate career in the Air Force. So I have a lot.
I've been through the Chenault Air Museum many times in Monroe, Louisiana. And I did read that in your bio. We got to take one last break. When we come back, we do have a member of our audience that's got a question. We'll take that question. We'll continue this discussion about Mr. French and the team that he was part of on the USS Gregory, his heroic actions, and maybe what we can do in the future and what has happened also as far as recognizing this great American. We'll be right back with Carol Abriette.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Is the government tracking you? Do they
All
have
right,
access
everybody.
to all
Don't
your
step
data?
away.
Well, if you go to worldviewtalk.com, you'll find out about a cell phone company that, well, does not store your data. They don't do that. This is what they're known for. They don't store your data. You have privacy. You're not being tracked. That's why a lot of folks are turning to worldviewtalk.com. You'll find their prices are very competitive. All the details are there at worldviewtalk.com. worldviewtalk.com. Again, worldviewtalk.com. Oh, while you're there, not only do they have cell phones that aren't tracking you, you can find out about how to get a satellite phone. Should the whole system go down and you want to communicate with a family member or a loved one, you might want to have a satellite phone. Or how about their solar generators? They have great solar generators. Check them all out right now. Worldtalk.com, worldviewtalk.com.
The end of the story, right? And I hate this because it's not the end of the story, but after his military service, French suffered from alcoholism and depression. He died on November 7th, 1956 in San Diego, California. He was only 37 years old.
Mm.
You know,
Sad.
And they still, we will like, I think at this point, we still are trying to consider him for a posthumous Medal of Honor.
Mm.
At this point.
I don't understand that either. You got somebody else told the story. You know what I mean? Like, it ain't like someone making this shit up. You know what I mean? The story is being told. He's a hero, you know, so I don't know.
Yeah, let's get this guy his Medal of Honor. You know what I'm saying? Let's get him his Medal of Honor. Like, what's going on? You know what I mean? Like, it's crazy because they had patriotic trading cards back in the day where like actual soldiers were on trading cards, and he was one of the soldiers on a trading card. He was also celebrated in black press, and it says subject of a syndicated comic strip. I just hate that, like, you know, these times in America or whatever was like so racist, you know, that like he had to be celebrated in like black press, but like not just American press. Like, this is an American who did some, you know, great stuff in our country, saved people, you know, all this. But we were just so like blinded by like just racial stuff that like we can't just give credit.
Hatred.
Yeah, we couldn't give credit where credit was due for a great, you know, man doing something great. That's so frustrating, man. But yeah, so man, like he was survived by his sister, but I just think that's so dope, man. Charles Jackson French, we talk about it all the time, but to jump into the shark infested waters, to navigate them, to be tugging 15 people or however many people he was tugging at that time until being rescued, right? Never gave up kind of stuff, man. That's dope.
4 to 6 hours. Crazy.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show here on Worldview Tube. It's More War Monday, and we're talking about Charles David French. Sorry. I get tongue-tied sometimes, Miss Carol, and the author of Midnight in the Iron Bottom Sound. This sailor is just absolutely remarkable how amazing he was. And those were two sailors talking about how he deserves the Medal of Honor. That's from, I think, about a year and a half ago. That little clip is there. And one of the reasons why I jumped at the chance to do this story is that I'm a believer, like I said at the beginning, in those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We don't ever want to repeat that part of our history. And that's why we can be where we're at today. Today, we have a United States Armed Forces that is colorblind, that is based on merit, and that does and has recognized this young man. You know, as a matter of fact, he's been given the Navy and Marine Corps medal from what I saw. And in addition to having the ship named after him and a post office and the historical marker, the swimming training center at one of the Navy bases. And if you want to put that graphic up, Mr. Producer, we can show folks that information.
Yeah,
and that came out of Congressman Bacon's office there, the aquatic facility out there training at the Naval Aviation School. So it's coming. It is here. But I'd like to see him. I think this man deserves a Medal of Honor. He committed his selfless action without regard to his own safety in the face of the enemy, having been fired on by the enemy, obviously at great personal risk and intrepidity, which is, you know, the words that are used in those types of citations. and he fits it. So I think we should still continue to ask and send a letter to the President of the United States, folks. Send a letter. Send him a copy, a clip of this show if you want. Send him a copy of the book with your letter and ask that he consider giving this man a Medal of Honor. Your thoughts, Carol?
Yes, exactly. Send a letter just like little 12-year-old Kenneth Dominique did, and just like Mr. Will, a very prominent businessman, did. So there were people in the United States, it wasn't just a blanket thing that everybody ignored this. The public seemingly loved hearing this story, and you have proof of that just by the reaction that just the few little clips here and there, article about what French had done in newspapers, created such a stir and caused a reaction there. And yes, I wholeheartedly agree. I do believe that this is equal to what I have read in the past is the qualifications or the criteria for awarding a Medal of Honor. I am also, feel so honored and privileged that I was able to get as much information as I was able to about the story and to tell the story and to just expose his story to a broad spectrum of people. And I think I do it for my children as much as anybody, quite honestly, doing these military history stories. If we don't get them down now, we're going to, the time is getting further and further away from World War II. If we don't record them now, we will lose them. They'll just drift away. And so I'm so thankful that I was able to find as much information and to get the story down. And I'm just hopeful that people will go out, purchase the book, order it off Amazon or wherever you can find, a bookstore, wherever sells books, and read it for yourself. The incredible courage and bravery of all of these young men, and especially in this incident of Charles Jackson French. I started the introduction with just a little bit, if I could read it just right now. This is the story of two of the gallant sailors of the USS Gregory, the highest ranking, who was the ship's commander, Harry Bower, and one of the lowest ranking, a mess attendant, second class, named Charles Jackson French. And they reveal a mostly unknown story. These men, along with their shipmates, who included a young ensign who witnessed it all, define one eternal truth. Courage has no color, no prerequisites, because valor hails from within.
That's right. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, we got some questions in the audience. We're coming to the end of the show, so we'll see if we can knock at least one of those out. Go ahead, right. Rob. Who's up?
Colonel, we have Cookie. Go ahead, Cookie.
Hey, thank you. Great show. I got your book here, right here, ready to order. The question I had is, what did the family think? What did the family think when you approached them about doing this book and the research? And what did they think after you've published the book? What were their thoughts on all of this?
Well, now, do you mean French's family or some of the other families? Let me start with his. They were just thrilled. I spoke with his nephew. It may even be his great nephew, Mr. Chester French. You saw his picture in one of the little clips earlier in the show. He was at the ceremony there in at the San Diego swimming pool. My understanding is the training pool there for the Navy. They are just thrilled. And at the back of the book, when you get your book, I had the families write a little tribute to their loved one, to their relative that was in the war. And you'll be able to read for yourself what Mr. French wrote in that, and what his how special all of this is for him. And of course, he's thrilled about the commissioning of the ship as well. So thank you so much, too, I think you'll really, really appreciate the story.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's take that last question real quick. Go ahead, Rob.
We have Navy guy, Colonel.
Hey, how you doing, Colonel? And I just wanted to give her a special thank you from, I'm a Navy petty officer as well, retired, and it's amazing her knowledge on that story. And those two ships were attacked by 3 destroyers, and the sad side of that story, after the ship went down, those 3 Japanese destroyers continued to fire on the sailors. And another awesome one, the nickname that she keeps saying is Raiders. Those are what you call your MARSOC Marines. They're Marine Special Operators, and they are bad to the bone. They are awesome guys. And I agree with her. He deserves the Medal of Honor for what he did. I don't know if you all know, he earned the nickname the Human Tugboat. And he's a well-known brother of ours, and he deserves anything they give him. And he ties greatly into Doris Miller. And if you ever get the honor,
Hey, Navy, I have a question, bro.
I was just wanting to thank them and thank them for what they're doing for a well-known Navy, and we honor him and love him. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Very familiar with the Dory Miller case too.
Yes.
And we appreciate you bringing that. Well, Carol, we've come to the end of our time, but tell us again where they can find the book, and maybe you mentioned you did a previous military book. What was the title of that?
Marine Raiders, the legendary World War II story of legendary battalions. I also did one called Coffin Corner Boys that is about a B-17 that went down over Nazi-occupied France. And I also did one of our longest-held Vietnam POWs called Captured, Tortured, Freed. He was in Hanoi prison for nearly 8 years, so helicopter pilot. So, yes, but
thank you so much.
This can be bought at midnight in Iron Bottom Sound, Amazon, or anywhere books are sold. You won't be disappointed.
Well, no, you won't be disappointed. I read it, and there were no dry eyes in my office when I read it. And I was the only one sitting here. I'll just be honest about that. Well, thank you so much, Carol. We appreciate you. We'll have you back at some point, I'm sure, hopefully when I'll interview you when he gets the Medal of Honor from maybe President Trump.
That would just be wonderful. And Colonel, thank you so much for your service too. I had some other things I wanted to mention to you about you. Were you a pilot?
I was a backseater, a bombardier in B-1
bombardier. Yes. All right. Well, we thank you so much for your service, and thank you so much for having me on. God bless.
Well, thank you. God bless you. And we thank the Lord for Bob Adrian too, whose journals and diaries really provided a lot of the information in addition to everything else that Carol was able to find in her research. Tomorrow, it's Tuesday. Got a great guest lined up for you. I'm going to surprise you, though. I'll see you then on Worldview Tube. And don't forget, the United States Armed Forces is damn colorblind, folks. We go out and we find and eliminate America's enemies, and we don't give a damn what color you are. I'll see you then.